This is the AI Advantage podcast, where we explore how AI is shaping professional services. My guest today built AI systems that can review an architectural drawing package against a building codes automatically. He's a trained architect who decided the industry needed its own AI, not just a wrapper around ChatGPT. Guido, welcome to the AI Advantage.
Thanks, Baker. Thanks for having me.
All right. Tell me your founding story. What made you decide AEC needed its own AI company?
So, founding story, that's a long journey, but I'll try to keep it short. So, as you mentioned, I've studied architecture, trained as an architect, but only worked as an actual architect for a couple of years before getting completely bored of that job and the frustrations of that job. And I, even during my studies, I was always into the technological aspect of architectural practice, the different tech tools and automations since my early days in university. And when I came out and started working in architecture, I immediately realized that everything that we were promised in our architectural studies was far from the reality of the architectural profession. And I became more and more attracted by the opportunity of leveraging technology to make that job more efficient. And that took me all the way from the UK, where I studied, to Australia. I spent 10 years working in computational design, focused on design to manufacture pipelines and automating digital fabrication workflows and complex geometry and design. And then 4 years ago, nearly 5 years ago now, I moved back to Italy. And that put me in a position where I had two choices. Either look for a job in corporate or a startup or in tech, or start my own thing. And having gone through 10 years of consulting and tech consulting in Australia, the choice was obvious for me. I saw a lot of things that I could have done better. And this was before the whole current AI wave. So I started broadening that service offering from computational design to actual custom software development, with a very strong focus on product thinking and product management. And that's what brought me closer to the tech world and how software is actually developed and deployed and how products are designed. And that whole world really fascinated me. And by the time the Gen AI wave hit, we had clients already. We had an established consultancy still working on the computational design and generative design verticals within the industry. And as soon as generative AI came out, and I still remember this, my first conversation with ChatGPT was actually generating a safe work method statement, which is something so random. I'm sure that, that wouldn't be your common first idea, but it just so happened that when I signed up to ChatGPT, I was working on exactly this problem, which was automating some construction health and safety management workflows. So that was my sort of light bulb moment. And literally from that moment on, I reimagined the consultancy as an AI native company and what it would mean to become an AI native tech consultancy within this space. And that is what started my journey into compliance, into safety, and then broadening that into AI platform engineering, which is what we're focused on now.
Okay. I think, let's double click on that. What is the core problem statement you're trying to solve now, and for whom? And why is it something that you need AI for?
So if we actually look at the AI market within AEC now, there's three major sort of problems that we see that are a challenge to adoption within this industry. The first one is that generic AI platforms, they're awesome and they're built for the masses, right? They're built to automate the majority of knowledge work, but not domain-specific work. So when we start to apply these, we see these platforms performing very well in things like generating content and video and image generation, content generation in general, really strong in HR, super strong in software engineering and code generation, but they don't really adapt well to industrial domains. And now we're seeing the surge of AI native companies that are adapting these technologies to specific domains. And within AEC, the challenges that we see are, one, there's you have access to generic AI platforms that don't understand AEC native data. Things like drawings and BIM models and schedules, contracts. They don't know what they are. They haven't been trained on them. Their training data set doesn't really contain much of this data at all. So it's not surprising that they perform badly. On the other side, you have companies, enterprises that are trying to adopt AI, but they don't have the means or the expertise. So they rely on internal IT teams, which are neither tech teams nor AI engineering teams. They don't have the capacity nor the skills. But companies and leadership assume that because they're an IT team, they're able to develop AI.
Yeah.
That's one problem. The other problem is that if you're not relying on your internal IT teams, then you go out to the market, and in the market, there's a lot of strategic consultants. All the big four, of course, they don't really create working systems, right? They show up with slide decks and strategy, but implementation is left to the company to figure out how to actually do that. Off-the-shelf software point solutions, of which there are thousands now because software development and creation of software is converging to zero. So there are a lot of off-the-shelf tools and point solutions, but they don't connect to each other. So if companies are adopting a single point solution for every problem they're trying to solve, they're going to create massive fragmentation while their goal is actually trying to solve fragmentation. And then, of course, if you have point solutions that don't speak to each other, you're never going to compound the value that you get from them. You're going to solve one problem and then another problem and another problem, but together they don't really create any compounding value. So the problem that the result is the typical enterprise sort of situation where you have very slow delivery, takes them 6 months to run a pilot, very high cost internally, unclear return on investment. They're just trying things out, but they haven't really done the work to measure the impact or to set clear KPIs. And the result is endless pilots. So we fit in this very unique hybrid space between strategic consulting, custom software development, and platform engineering, but we're neither software vendors, we're not a dev shop, we're not strategic consultants, we're a mix of all these things together. And the key difference with our team is that we have cross-functional expertise. So a lot of our team is ex-AEC, like I'm trained as an architect. Other members of the team are structural engineers and civil engineers. And then we have the actual AI and ML experts. So when we mix these two together, we get this really powerful ensemble of expertise that lets us adapt AI and ML technologies to the domain of AEC specifically.
Okay, gotcha. We'll go into Archie and what you're trying to do there. But I think you've written about absent product mindset in AEC. The idea is that everybody just thinks about projects, not products. What does it mean for how AI gets built and adopted inside these firms? Maybe you can double click on that.
Yes. So the difference between projects and products in the simplest sense is that if you look at a project within AEC, or really any kind of project, it's defined by a start date, an end date, a list of requirements and deliverables, and everybody works towards those deliverables. And once it's finished, it's done. Products are never ending. The moment that a product stops being developed in its life cycle, it means that it's obsolete and it's going to be decommissioned, right? There is no product in the world where you don't expect to get new features, right? And projects are not like that. You're not going to add new features to a project once it's complete. So this idea of completion versus continuous improvement is the real difference between projects and products. And with AI, this is particularly important and critical now because of the speed of progress, where the industry needs to realize that they're trying to adopt bleeding edge technology while having the expectation of stable, predictable results, which are two things that cannot coexist. So if you're in AEC, you're an enterprise and you're looking at AI and you want to adopt AI, you have to realize that, yes, you're going to be leading the pack. But with that also comes the responsibility and the understanding of failure and experimentation, research. And that is something that is very lacking in the industry as a mindset. We're not used to R&D, right? We're just used to having top-down requirements and executing on them.
That's right. It is a very scary proposition to many big companies. It is not the mindset, and especially some of the companies have existed for a long time by doing things in a certain way. And now we're asking them to do something that is extremely different and also add more risk to their execution. So it's definitely a challenging thing. Maybe we can spend a little bit of time on open source. You've spent a lot of time contributing to the open source and also built few things in open source. I see that you've created G-Shark, a geometry library. Can you talk about what is the open source libraries that are out there for AEC, and how have you contributed, and what are the areas where you see a lot more contribution happening there?
I think there's very interesting things happening in the whole AEC data space in terms of open source. We have a lot more access to geometry libraries. We have a lot more access to pretty complex stacks like building IFC viewers on web browsers or interacting with large geometric information and BIM information and GIS information. So that's all very accessible now compared to even just 6 or 7 years ago, when there really wasn't much of this stuff around and you had to rely on Autodesk and all of the incumbents and whatever they were providing in terms of SDKs and APIs and so on. So I think it's really important. And within AI, I think that's even more of an opportunity, of course. And we can see this happening, which wasn't the case when Gen AI burst onto the scene. The open source community took a little bit of time to catch up, but then almost at this point, I think it's almost overtaken. If not overtaken, it's on parity with commercial providers. So we're seeing all the models, whether they're commercial models from OpenAI or Anthropic or Meta, closed source and open source, as well as models from Alibaba and so on. They're all converging. There was a big difference maybe 6-9 months ago between open source and closed source. Now there's almost zero difference, which is very interesting. And it points towards a future where these models and access to these things is completely commoditized, and it doesn't really matter anymore which model you're using. It's much more important where you put that model, the context within which you put that model to work becomes way more important than the model itself.
I think let's take a typical project. So maybe you can take one of your customers, and then what kind of projects did you help with? What was the problem statement? How did you think about a solution that works? And then you can actually go into the details of what kind of model you used and how did you enable a whole bunch of things. And then what kind of business outcomes that you've delivered for them. And then a journey of how you brought AI into AEC company.
Sure. Let's start with the journey, because I think the way that we work and the model, the delivery model that we use is as much part of the business model as it is part of the clients and customers' journey. So if we go back to that idea of point solutions versus platforms, I'd like to talk about that for a little bit. We moved away. So our company has evolved from a services company to a service as a product company. And now we're focusing on the next evolution of the company, which is an AI platform company. And this has been a very natural progression from the learnings that we have from clients and building our own pipelines and components that we can then reuse. And this is important because when we work with clients, we never start from zero. We always show up with some form of platform, and this can be as broad or as narrow, but there's always some underlying foundational components and foundational work that we do first to enable the rest of the journey for a client. And that always starts with an initial engagement, which you might typically call discovery engagement within classic consultancy, but we never do this alone. We never do strategy without implementation. So we bundle discovery and the first round of implementation in one package. And that also involves the deployment of these underlying foundational capabilities. So to give you an example, a concrete example that might be useful to understand this, if we're working with a client, let's say on knowledge management and decision intelligence, right? So we're trying to take a company's institutional knowledge, transform it into AI readable data, and then give access to that data to agentic workflows and AI agents that can actually perform real work according to the company's own procedures and expertise. That journey starts with building the foundations for ingesting data and transforming it into machine readable data so that we can do everything else. It doesn't start with the custom solution, the custom chatbot to be able to answer a question. It starts with building the knowledge layer, and then a chatbot that answers questions based on that knowledge is really a very simple implementation and only the first step. On top of that, once you have access to that knowledge, can start to power all sorts of different workflows and automations. And in terms of business impact, there's also another very important point here, which is to do with evaluations. There's very few AI companies and products on the market that will offer you a lens or into behind the scenes of what's actually going on with the product and the models. How is the model thinking? How is it arriving at a specific answer? What knowledge did it access? How did it come to a certain decision? If you're not tracking any of this and you're not benchmarking it against your subject matter experts' reviews and knowledge, you never really know if you're getting good results or not. And this is one of the big problems with pilots within enterprises. Everything looks good on the surface when you run a pilot. The chat is answering questions. They look right, awesome. And then you put it in the hands of an expert or a few experts that try to use it for real work. And that's where all the bugs and issues start coming up.
That's
so it's very important for us to establish the foundations for successful AI development first, and then develop custom solutions on top of that. And once we have that foundation and a first solution or a first high value use case that demonstrates immediate value to the company, adding new functionality and new use cases and new workflows is one, easier, and two, because you're doing it on the same foundational layers and infrastructure underneath, the same knowledge layer, you can keep building on top of the same foundation. And as you build every use case, they compound. Every use case you add will extend the knowledge layer for the next and will leverage all of the knowledge that was built before it.
And how long is this journey? When somebody brings you in, let's say knowledge management is a classic one, is it like 6-month journey that somebody has to go through from the time they talk to you first to getting something that is production ready and deployed across the company? How long are you talking about?
So our target is a maximum of 8 weeks for the first use case. And this is a reasonable amount of time for us to prove value. And the reason it's so fast, or it might seem so fast in comparison to, typical consulting or your internal IT team, is because we're an AI native company ourselves. So everything we do for clients, we do for ourselves. So all of our processes internally in terms of business operations and admin and project management, financials, it's all automated. So we get to focus exclusively on the work and the solution. And we don't have to waste a lot of time with the low value work, let's call it that way, the low value work that doesn't actually bring clients any immediate impact.
Okay, great. Can we talk about what is Archie?
Sure. So Archie was born as a building code co-pilot 3 years ago now for the National Construction Code of Australia. And this was really very much an experiment for us, and this is how we use products. So we developed these smaller products, which you could consider vertical slices through our platform and capabilities. And we use this flywheel of creating products and putting them out to market, usually for free, to gather industry data. So we wanted to see how will professionals interact with an AI assistant. And remember, 3 years ago, these assistants were literally just being created, right? So the industry hadn't been exposed to them yet. So we built Archie really for the purpose of understanding how professionals within AEC, working within compliance workflows, of course, and referring to building codes, would interact with a chatbot that would provide cited answers and references to original source materials, to enable them to essentially search through institutional knowledge, in this case, building codes, in a much, much faster and more efficient and useful contextualized way. And really the problem we were trying to solve there is this knowledge search problem, where approximately 30% of services companies' time is spent on looking for stuff and not actually doing stuff. So
wow. It's 30%, huh? That's pretty sizable number.
It is, but it's also not surprising. If you've ever worked in an enterprise, or if you worked in an architecture firm, a lot of the time you're just looking for stuff. You're asking people, where is that? I remember we did that project for that school 2 years ago and we used the same detail. Who did that? Oh, it was John. Okay, let's go talk to John. Oh no, John left the company 3 years ago. That's a shame. Now that knowledge is nowhere to be found, right? It's those kinds of problems. Knowledge is everywhere. It's just inaccessible. So we were trying to solve for that. And then that was the initial prototype. And then the vision aspect of it, the idea of, can we use vision models and multimodal models to analyze and extract information from technical drawings and then cross-reference it to compliance requirements? That was the next sort of big push for Archie, which was not successful at all. And the interesting thing there, it took us into another piece of research called AEC Bench. I'm not sure if you've come across it, but we released this a few months ago now, where we were...
Can you talk? I see that there are two benchmarks that you published, AEC Bench and AECV Bench. Can you tell us what those two things are and then how it connects back to Archie?
Yes. So AEC Bench was actually published by Nomic, and our research was referenced by their research. So we created this benchmark with the idea of, we need to introduce benchmarking as a concept within this industry, just because there's literally none of it, nowhere to be seen. And the good thing is that now we're seeing more and more of this. So the idea behind the benchmark was to have proof that we could measure that the performance of these multimodal models within the domain of drawing understanding. And the reason we did this was as a wake-up call to the industry. So the pattern that we're seeing is that frontier models will release new models and new capabilities. And they talk about these capabilities very generically, right? They'll say GPT 5.4 will come out, or 5.2 or whatever, it doesn't matter. And they'll say, oh, we've greatly improved the vision capabilities of these models. These models can now understand complex visual diagrams and charts and things, right? So the natural projection within the industry is, great. We have an industry that relies enormously on visual data, right? Everything, a lot of what we do is visual and is represented graphically. So therefore, if these models and these companies are saying these models are amazing at vision tasks, surely they'll be really good at reading my drawings. And they set up whole pilots around this. Someone within an enterprise will read the article that these models are amazing at vision, and they're like, okay, great, let's put some budget towards building a drawing extraction tool or a QA/QC workflow that uses GPT 5.4 because they said it was really good at understanding visual documents, right? They set it up and they start working with it, and then you just get bad results out of it, right? Unsurprisingly. Right? And it's unsurprising if you know what the models were trained on, what they really mean when they're saying they're good at vision and so on. Without any data for the industry just plays blind, right? They have to rely on what these companies say. They test it in a limited, superficial way. They get bad results. And then trust goes out the window. And leadership is now, okay, no, this doesn't work. It's another failed pilot. We've wasted more money on this. Everybody said it was going to work, but it didn't. So we started to approach it from how AI and ML has always approached it, with benchmarks. There's benchmarks for all these models. And when they say they're good at vision, it's because they ran it on a visual document benchmark that doesn't contain drawings, of course. And they give you the results based on those benchmarks. So we thought we have to start building these benchmarks and data sets that represent industrial domains. And for us, it's architectural drawings and engineering drawings and construction schedules and things like that. So we picked architectural floor plans as a limited data set. We have very little access to data set because it's hard to get your hands on, thousands of proprietary drawings. So we need the help from industry. So we created the benchmark, as I said, as a wake-up call to show the industry that this is how you want to do this. You want to identify the workflow. You want to identify the metrics and KPIs that represent a successful outcome for that particular workflow. And then you want to benchmark different models against it. And what that is going to tell you is if you can use the models out of the box, or if you need some clever orchestration or adaptation or special fine-tuning or custom training of models. And this is really what companies should be looking to discover as a first step within any AI initiative. And this is part of our initial engagement that we spoke about before. Within those 8 weeks, for any use case, one of the first steps is setting up those benchmarking pipelines so that we can actually measure real outcomes and not just go off vibes, essentially. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there is, unless you know what is good, you don't know how to improve, right? At least it sets the bar. I think this is something you mentioned, but it's important for listeners to know since you do this for a living. You've described 5 barriers to AI adoption in AEC, and every industry has similar, but sometimes not so similar barriers. Maybe you can talk about what are the barriers and which one kills the most projects before they even start.
I think we can focus on just one, and it's not starting projects. It's the fear of not doing anything or sitting on the sidelines and waiting for somebody else to solve your problem instead of investing in trying to do it yourself. And we can talk about the buy, build, partner divide, but I think it's just being held back by the fear of the unknown or not having the guarantees of positive outcomes. So the inability to experiment, I think, is ultimately the biggest, one of the biggest, if not the biggest barrier in this industry for all of the reasons that we spoke about before, projects versus products and so on. The other major barrier that I see comes back to what we said earlier, which is the lack of product thinking within the industry. And that is not only just a mindset thing, it's an organizational problem. The roles and the team structures and the organizational structures to support product thinking and experimentation and R&D and continuous improvement and agile development, for lack of a better term, I think that is one of the biggest barriers. It's just you don't have the right people, and you don't have the right mix of people, and you don't have the right mix of people with the right level of freedom to experiment within the enterprise and the organization. And I think that is literally the biggest bottleneck, is relying on your IT team and rebranding it as a tech team or an AI team just because they use computers. I think that is a massive challenge. The other huge challenge, I think, is that a lot of the work and effort that goes into developing these kinds of tools within enterprises in AEC, because they're all project-based, all of the budgets are project-based as well. And therefore, any kind of development is typically carved out of billable hours on a project. And so it's always a second-class citizen. It's never, we're just going to invest in this, and if it fails, but at least we've learned something. That is something very rare within AEC organization. It's always tied to some project budget, and of course, the project always takes precedence.
Yeah. I think building software is not necessarily the core competency, right? So it is something that I think most of the firms are learning. You mentioned actually 5 barriers in on your website. I just want to double click on one of them. You didn't mention that. You talked, I think there are 5 you mentioned: legacy software, siloed data, human capital gaps, which you referred here, limited cloud solutions, and absent product mindset. I think you covered 3 out of the 5. But I want to double click on legacy software and siloed data. Siloed data is a problem across the verticals. Every vertical, there is a data problem or siloed data problem. But I think one thing that we don't talk about particularly is AEC has a lot of legacy software. So can you touch on both of them?
Yes. Siloed data, I think it's important to talk about it not only in terms of siloed data within digital systems. I think a lot of the siloed data within AEC is siloed in paper and PDF. In fact, most of the valuable data that we rely on is a PDF, mostly. And then, of course, you have the siloed data within databases. There's many of them. Within any enterprise, AEC enterprise, they'll have hundreds of different databases. Each department will have a database. Each team will have some database in some form or other where they're storing knowledge. And there's nobody really has a map of where all this stuff is. Everybody has their own individual repository of knowledge, but nobody at the organizational level can tell you where any of that knowledge is. So I think,
do you face your favorite database SharePoint with all your customers?
yeah, that is a classic one, but it's not an issue for us. I think our approach is you don't need to move that data. You don't need to touch those legacy systems. The reality is that you're not going to replace them. Nobody's going to replace Autodesk and Procore at this point anytime soon. Right?
Yeah.
So there's no point competing with them, and we don't even try it. We don't think that is the move. We think that the platform approach just has to be a neutral layer that sits in between the systems. It doesn't move the data. It just absorbs it and transforms it, makes it accessible, but it doesn't have to move or replace any of these legacy systems. Realistically, I don't think the industry is going to get away from these legacy systems, and it's the same as banking and manufacturing and any other industrial domain.
Yeah.
You have to deal with it.
Yeah. And so you're working on a layer that is abstracted, which can connect to all the data sources and just make those workflows work and do whatever AI is supposed to do. I think on one of your case studies, you mentioned a couple of stats. You have a document intelligence case study where you achieved 90% accuracy and 5x speed improvement. So I was fascinated by these two numbers. Maybe you can talk about what is that case study? What problem were you trying to solve for one of your customers? And how did you achieve this accuracy? What was it before? What was it after the project? And then both from a speed as well. What was it before? What was it after? And how does it really impact the day-to-day of whoever is consuming this new AI capability? Can you talk through that?
Yes. So when it comes to document intelligence, there's many different ways to measure accuracy. And of course, in a use case, in a sort of high-level case study, we don't go into the specificities of accuracy metrics. But the accuracy in that case had to do with the accuracy of extracting and structuring information from invoices, I believe, for a material supplier. I think that's the use case you're referring to, possibly. But it applies to pretty much all document intelligence and document extraction workflows. What was the accuracy before? That wasn't really the thing that we were trying to fix. The accuracy before was less than 90 due to human error, but it wasn't that much less than 90. The problem was the insane amount of human resources and time spent on moving data from a paper document onto an Excel spreadsheet and then onto a database, which is a typical problem in many different domains and scenarios. 5x improvement is purely to do with speed. So if this company has 10,000 different invoices to process a month and they're really complex with a lot of line items or complex invoice structures and so on, they just use a lot of resources and a lot of human effort to do extremely low value work where AI can, outcompete a human in both speed and accuracy and can deliver much more consistent results in terms of quality. The standardization of quality is a key result there. So the 5x improvement is really on the volume of processed documents in that case.
Okay. I think this is a classic use case when you have a lot of documents. I think if you have the right AI applied, the speed and the quality should increase, right? I think we talked a lot about all the positive things that you were able to do, but we know that AI has a way of doing something that is bad and sometimes that is high stake. Maybe we can talk about where has AI gotten wrong in some of the work you've done for your clients, a product that underperformed, a model that failed in some high stakes context. What did you learn from that experience? Obviously, every project is different. And what did you change and how did your thinking evolve?
Yeah, so I think early on, we were dangerously less concerned with evaluations. So we were very much focused on outcomes, right? It's like, how do we get this thing to do some useful work? And we were less bothered with how do we measure whether it's doing good work or not. And within something like Archie, for example, is a really great example. I'm trained as an architect, but again, I only worked as an architect for 2 years in Italy, right? So none of my experience would apply to code compliance in Australia, for example. And that's the case for everybody in the team. We have the expertise, but we don't have the depth of expertise that an architect would have to be able to evaluate the outputs of something like Archie. And this is, again, one of the reasons why we put it out to market, is to learn from the feedback from users. And to our surprise, of course, it looked amazing to us. It was like, this thing is answering the questions, it's doing calculations, it's working out like how to design a stair given the constraints. It's looking at drawings and then looking up fire ratings and seeing if it's compliant and everything. And it all looks amazing. And then we put it out to market. And of course, it's got feedback, in-app feedback mechanisms where you can provide feedback. And man, some of the feedback was beyond harsh. It's almost insulting. People are almost viscerally angry at this thing for getting answers wrong, simple answers. Mm-hmm. And we can see how quickly trust breaks down with these systems. It takes one single critical response that is just making the wrong conclusion, where an expert would make that conclusion without even thinking. Mm-hmm. And suddenly the trust barrier just out the window. They just stop using it. Yeah. So what we learned from that is to expose and provide as much information as possible about the model's reasoning, and making sure that people understand that they're the experts. This is an assistant. It's helping you out, but it's not smarter than you. It's going to be faster than you. It's going to be better than you at looking for stuff and retrieving things. But ultimately, you're still the expert. You're still the domain expert. You are going to make better decisions. What we're trying to do is enable you with the knowledge to make those decisions, not make a decision for you, right? So a lot of what we did there and what we do now, of course, is try to implement as much of these feedback mechanisms as early as possible, but also build the good evaluation data sets, which we can't do with Archie because we don't have any clients to work with, right? So that it's not like the public is going to give us back that expert feedback. But when we deploy these systems, so if we take Archie and we deploy it and customize it for a specific client, we take that pipeline and implement it for a client, the first thing we would do is come up with a list of 100 questions that are in varying levels of complexity, different tasks that are vetted by the client's own subject matter experts internally. And then we run these benchmarking and review pipelines with the experts very early on before rolling it out to anybody else. So that at least there's a chance and a moment to understand the baseline performance. And it doesn't have to be good. It just has to be something. It just has to point in the right direction, right? Is it going towards improvement or is it degrading? That's all we're trying to measure. Once you get the signal that it is improving, then you can start to speed up what you do. Different things, different techniques and approaches that you can benchmark against that evaluation data set that was built with the experts. And I think that's really the only way to get to true domain adaptation for these AI systems, is with these human-in-the-loop feedback mechanisms and establishing subject matter expert-driven benchmark data sets very early on.
Yeah, that's great. Can you talk a little bit about which models do you use, and is there any favorite model for a particular task or type of work? Obviously, there is a lot of what Cloud is doing, and they announced Opus new version yesterday, and there is Mythos that is coming up soon. Obviously, OpenAI is announcing their own. Everybody has so many premier models, and obviously everybody has a favorite open source model. Maybe you can talk about what are the top 3 models that you use, open source or premium ones, and what use case, what purpose are you using that particular model?
Yeah, again, for clients, it's a different story. It's a much more data-driven approach. We'll benchmark different models and pick the one that's the best for the job. It doesn't matter how big it is or how expensive it is. We optimize against cost and latency and accuracy afterwards. But initially, we try to identify out of the commercial frontier models. We always start with the frontier models first. We try to identify which one is best suited to a particular type of task. Internally to our company, it's a different story. That's very personal. So I can tell you from a personal point of view, I think there's an interesting discussion here that we really have a relationship with these models. Like you get attached emotionally to these things, and you get attached to their personality, right? And we can see when things change, like when 4.0, GPT 4.0, they shifted and there's a whole movement online that's still going. The hashtag bring back 4.0 on X. And that's still happening because people are genuinely upset when these things change personality and you've gotten used to interacting with this character, right?
That's correct.
So from my personal point of view, I love GPT's sort of austerity. It's very cold and professional, very unemotional. And I like that for a lot of the kind of admin work that we do. So things writing specs or writing coding, very deep plans for spec plans for code generation, as well as writing things like scopes of work or pricing strategies or analyzing our team's performance. I don't want any emotion in that. I don't want any sort of particular type of character. And GPT is cold and boring in that sense. And I love that about it. Claude, on the other hand, is I like to look at it as almost like a philosopher. It's more of a
deep
teacher.
Thinker.
Yeah, deep thinker. It has a lot of personality. It's very opinionated in terms of its character, right? And I love that for content. Like Claude for content generation, it has much more nuance. It feels more human and it feels more intelligent. It's like almost academic level intelligence compared to GPT. Open source models, we don't use much for this kind of work. We use them more for specific tasks, like things like document intelligence. There's a lot of all the Quen models, for example, are exceptional at OCR and vision tasks and so on. So we'll pick different things for different tasks. But generally, I would say Claude for content, as well as code generation. But lately, and this might change with 4.7 now that it's come out, lately, over the last months, we've shifted a little bit away from Claude and Claude Code towards Codex. Just because we saw on the stuff that we were working on, we saw that Claude started having some performance issues. And the theory is that because, and this, I don't know if this is even true or if it's like a conspiracy theory, but the idea is that because Anthropic was releasing 4.7 and working on Mythos, and their compute is limited compared to OpenAI and the other companies, they somehow or did something to basically shift compute capacity from 4.6 to everything else they were doing. And 4.6 got stupid over the last couple of weeks. Started doing stuff that we hadn't seen for a year.
Yeah, we've had some performance issues, latency issues on Claude recently. That's interesting. But from your customer standpoint, you said the best model wins, but is the best model typically an open source model, or is it one of the premium models?
We always start with the premium models. And if they perform well, if there's no cost optimization that's needed, like if they perform at a really high accuracy at an acceptable cost, we just don't optimize. If we have to optimize for cost or latency or privacy, of course, then we start looking at open source models. But with clients, we're vendor agnostic. So the way that we deploy the stuff, we don't care what the model is. It doesn't really matter. You can swap it out for pretty much anything as long as it performs well. But oftentimes we're constrained in the choice of model by the company's own deals that they've made or whatever company they've decided to get into bed with, right? And if they've got an Anthropic enterprise license, they don't care that GPT is a better model for the task. They're like, nope, we're
going to just use what we have.
Yeah, we've got millions of dollars in free credits, so that's what we're going to use.
2 questions and then we'll wrap up. Can you talk about, you are part of AI task force in Ireland before, the official industry voice on AI policy. It is a big topic. Obviously, as a European, you have better policies, a little bit more advanced than what we have here in the US. Can you talk about that and how regulatory and ethics layer, most firms are not thinking about it, right? And they're already deploying AI. What should they be preparing for and what one or two suggestions you have for them?
To be honest, I'm not very well versed on the regulation side of things in Europe because most of our clients are in the US. However, we're working currently, just as an example, with a client in the Middle East whose headquarters are in Europe, and they have very stringent data privacy and data residency requirements that they have to satisfy. Not a big deal. I think there's pretty standard ways to architect these systems to satisfy those requirements. They just have to be made clear upfront. But if you want to talk about it from a political point of view or a progress point of view, I think there's a good middle ground between the US and Europe. I think the US and Europe represent, at the moment, the two extremes, like total deregulation and way too much regulation on the other side. I think somewhere in the middle is the happy middle ground we have to get to.
So as a platform, what are the three, or if there are a lot of people who are trying to build their own platforms or at least AI versions of products. So are there two or three principles that you have applied for building your platforms that are applicable? Like it could be on how do you think about data privacy when you build this platform? How do you think about who's going to make governance decisions? Right? Are there a few that you've already figured out because you've been doing this for a while that are helpful for any AEC company?
I think step one is you have to be very diligent at mapping out your processes first. I think two is don't try to translate the processes that you map directly into an AI automation solution. Map the process, then look at AI and the capabilities, look at the gaps between them, and then re-engineer the process around the capabilities of AI. And that could mean throw out the old process altogether. But it's very important to first map it out. You need to map out the process first. I think that will go a long way. And the second point I would say is focus on the knowledge layer first. Focus on making your institutional knowledge accessible to AI as the first step in any kind of initiative, whether it's a small pilot or whether it's a larger platform that you're trying to build. The knowledge layer is the thing that will differentiate your company from anybody else, and it's the thing that AI needs to adapt to so that it works for you and in the way that you work. I think those are the two real key things that anyone should do. And it doesn't matter if you're doing a little small product, small pilot, or an organization-wide platform.
Can you talk about the AI champion? Like every company that is embarking on this AI journey, you talked about having an AI champion. What does the AI champion supposed to do? How do they start? And how do they really make sure whatever they're deploying is actually useful to all their employees, but also safe as they use it?
Yes. So the AI champion, I think, is, at least for us, it's the key to everything. Without one, it's very hard for us to even get a client, right? So the AI champion has to be that person who, for lack of a better term, falls in love with the technology to the point where they become obsessed with it and they think about it all day long, and they start to understand it at a deeper level. They start to understand, how does a language model work behind the scenes? Not because they need to rebuild one, not because they need to build their own language model, but because when you start to dig deeper and look behind the curtain, it starts to inform how and where and when you deploy these systems in useful ways. And I think that is really the type of person that we always look for within companies. And of course, they have to be sitting, it can't just be someone who's passionate about AI and wants to implement it. They have to be sitting somewhere in the organization where they have enough leverage to be able to push and change culture, right? And that's very important. It's how do you build that trust in these systems? And how do you get people to follow you along and transmit that passion and communicate that passion to everybody else?
Awesome. Last question. I ask this to all my guests. A principal of a 100% engineering firm is listening right now. They know they're behind on AI. They've been to conferences, seen a whole bunch of demos and whatnot. What's the one thing they should actually do this month?
Call me, obviously.
That's a great way to end this session. Guido, really appreciate your time and good luck. And thanks for championing AI to all the AEC firms.
My pleasure, Baker. Thank you so much for having me.